Hi folks, my name is Dr. Rizwan Mustafa and I'm here to share a short presentation with you around counter-terrorism and policing. Specifically, the title of today's presentation is Muslims, Islam and Islamists, What's the Difference? Sensitivities in the Use of Language in Counter-Terrorism. Let's jump straight into it because we don't have a huge amount of time. The aim of the presentation today is to provide you with an understanding of sensitivities regarding the use of language in counter-terrorism arenas. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to walk away with some of that learning. But before we actually get into the intricacies of it, let me ask you a question. As you're sitting, wherever you're sitting, allow yourself to reflect on this question. What is a Muslim? Do you know what a Muslim is? And whilst you're thinking about that, do you know what Islam is? Or indeed, what is Islam? And one feeds into the other. If you know what a Muslim is, then perhaps you also know what Islam is. Or if you know what Islam is, then by nature of association, you also know what a Muslim is. But let me throw something else into the mix. What is an Islamist? How is an Islamist different from a Muslim? And how is Islamism different from Islam? Are they any different? Or are they the same? And what implications does that have? Either the similarity or the difference for those folks who work in the counter-terrorism space, or in this context, for the counter-terrorism police. Whilst you're deliberating that, and you're thinking about some of those discussions or some of those questions, let's have a look at why these things are so important. Let's appreciate the backdrop in a bit more detail. So, when we look at discussions around national threats, when we look at conversations around what the security threat is, or the greatest security threat is to the UK at this moment in time, a report that was released by the Counter-Terrorism Police in November 2020 stated that the greatest threat at this moment in time is still militant Islamism or Islamist ideology, whether it's militant or not, but Islamist ideology. And that indeed 24% of referrals that were being made at the moment were based on this ideology. The far right is increasing. I think that's at 22% based upon the November report. But almost a quarter of all referrals to the government's counter-terrorism program PREVENT have been based on Islamist ideology. And the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act in 2015 placed a statutory responsibility on all public sector organisations. So us folks in the education sector, public health, and all of those other statutory bodies now have a responsibility to safeguard folks from terrorism, to report and refer questionable practices or questionable individuals, or individuals who are a cause of further deliberation is perhaps the safest way to say it, through the reporting mechanisms, either to PREVENT or to the counter-terrorism unit. And bearing in mind that the positionality of the greatest threat is Islamist ideology, it's important to have an understanding what Islamism is. And then you've also got these conversations. So this is a tweet by the National Coordinator for PREVENT. His name's Nick Adams, Chief Superintendent from the Counter-Terrorism Command in Scotland Yard, supporting the data that was released by the Counter-Terrorism Police's report in November, stating that Islamist-inspired terrorism remains the greatest threat to the UK. And that's substantiated by the 24% of PREVENT referrals that have been made based or related to Islamist ideology. But then he also goes on to say that the ideology is condemned by the vast majority of British Muslims. So that would suggest that Islamism and Islam are two different entities, two different bodies. But what is the difference? How are they different? Surely if the vast majority of Muslims condemn the ideology, then that makes it different from mainstream Islam or normal Islam, if there is such a term. But we're still unclear around what Islamism is. So that's the backdrop. You've got a national security threat. That national security threat is based upon Islamist ideology. Yet at this moment in time, certainly within this conversation or this presentation, there's an ambiguity around what is considered to be Islamist, what is considered to be Islamism. And more importantly, there's a distinction between Islamism and mainstream normative Islam that is practiced by, according to the tweet, the vast majority of Muslims who condemn the ideology of Islamism. But the differences are yet unknown. And if you don't know the differences, how can you enforce the government strategy? How can you deliver against the security agenda? So let's have a look at what Islamism is, and let's have some conversation and discussion around that. So a brief history of the term Islamism. It's a colonial term that was developed in the 17th, 18th century by French academics, Oriental academics who were looking at the East and the phenomenon of Islam in the East and trying to make sense of it and trying to explain it. Incidentally, it was used to refer to the practice that Muhammad, as the Prophet of Islam, embodied. And prior to the term Islamism or Islamisme, my French is appalling, so forgive me if there's any native French speakers listening or watching this, but the French equivalent of Islamism was preceded by a term called Mohammedanism, and Mohammedanism was on par or a parallel adjective to Christianity, where Jesus Christ was the central figure of Christianity. So too the rationale within the French academic Orientalist writings was Muhammad is the figure point of Islam. So the description used for the practice of the faith was Mohammedism. And that lasted for a while before it was surpassed by the term Islamisme or Islamism, the French equivalent. And the term originally was used to describe the practice of faith, and that remained for a couple of hundred years before a shorter abridged version of Islamisme was replaced by Islam in and of itself. And you know, Islam is the kind of term that replaced Islamism, and it is a term that is also recognized in the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, and it's a term that is referred to by Muslims within the kind of revelation itself. However, in the late 70s and early 80s, when there was the Algerian uprising against French colonial powers, the term Islamism resurfaced in French academic writings, and it was utilized as a label to describe folks who used religion as the vehicle to communicate a political agenda or a political drive. And there's a whole history that is behind this that obviously we don't have time to go into now. But one of the foremost authorities in this field is a guy by the name of Giles Keppel, who's written a book called Jihad, the Trail of Political Islam, which is arguably the definitive point in time when this term resurfaced in the French language and found itself through translated works of Keppel's research into the English language during the mid-90s. So for the first 200 years or so, Islamism was a term that was used to describe the religion of Islam. That was superseded by Islam itself, and it became a dormant term. Islamism became dormant until the 70s and 80s when French separatist movements in colonial land spaces use the veneer and the persuasion of religion to galvanize the masses against what they considered to be brutal and oppressive regimes. And that's where the term Islamism was reborn to describe what is also referred to as political Islam. So at one point in time in its history and genealogy, it was conceived as a post-Enlightenment European modernity descriptor to talk about Islam, and then that became a label for political activism, which was quite often militant and was quite often violent. And what ultimately happened as a result of that was that it then became a definitive label to talk about political violence that was rooted in, or the belief is that it was rooted in, religion or religious ideology. And that's the kind of brief genealogy of the term. And that's reflected in some of the definitions that we now see regarding Islamism. And if you just take two or a couple here, we have one by the encyclopedia. There's one by Brookings, which is a think tank in the United States, around what Islamism is. And you can have a read of these, but you'll find that there are some kind of common factors within this, referred to the birth of political Islam, a broad set of political ideologies that utilize Islamic symbols for a social political objective, and again a wide spectrum of behaviors and belief. Politics is also referred to within that, and I'll let you folks pause the presentation and have a read through of that. Now, when you read through that as a conceptual proposition, you find that, well, actually, you know what, this is fine. You know what, it makes absolute sense. This, is a religious ideology that is working towards a political change or an intended political outcome. However, the problem with this is when you kind of date back to the development of politics as we understand it today, and we look at how society is constructed, you begin to understand, well, actually, the separation of religion from public space is a product of the Enlightenment, is a product of modernity, is a product of the revolutionary movements that kind of took form or took root in Europe during the 17th and 18th century. Prior to that, arguably everything was religiously rooted. The conception of violence, not just within the faith of Islam, but the major traditions and the major religions, couldn't happen without the blessing of the church or the higher authorities, the higher powers. Indeed, the Crusades are a kind of testament to that. And the actual uprising against inequality in Europe during the time of the European Revolution was to challenge religious inequality, and terrorism in that sense was the mechanism and the model through which social stability was drawn back into society once there had been an uprising and once there had been a challenge to power, or a state of savagery, as it's referred to, had taken hold of a context. Terrorism was utilized to bring normality back into that. And there's a great book that's been written by Bruce Hoffman that talks about the history of terrorism, which I'd encourage you folks to have a read of, and it details it all in there. But the point is that when we look at it from the post-Enlightenment perspective, and we try to engage with a theological entity that doesn't recognize the division of church or state or religion from public space, then you have a opaque definition when it comes to the practical application. So even though theoretically you have a definitive understanding of what Islamism is, for example, as what Encyclopedia Britannica says or what Brookings say, there is, however, a huge ambiguity around applying that term. And these are some of the contentions that have been raised against the term Islamism by folks like Mehdi Muzaffari, Martin Kramer, Gabriel Moranchi, who are anthropologists and sociological historians that talk about the development of the term and the fact that it is so opaque that it leaves, in fact, what Brookings have mentioned at this moment in time, that there is an opaqueness around it. It's difficult to just determine exactly what those behaviors and beliefs are, because when you talk about behavior and belief rooted in religion, well, what do you consider that to be? Is behavior prayer? Is it worship? Is it spending charity? Because these are some of the things that have been attributed to Islamism. If you look at Cherie Berman's research on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, these are some of the things that she pulls out as indicators of Islamist organizations. Yet when you look at the practice of faith, you will understand that Islam considers these to be absolutely normal faith practices. So The definition conceptually exists, but practically it's problematic, because practically to apply that definition is so opaque and ambiguous, it leads to outcomes that are unsubstantiated. Yeah, because you're trying to pin down behaviors that haven't been defined. So that's the history of the term, and that's the definition of the term, and those are some of the issues with the definition when it comes to practical application. And this creates ambiguity, folks. It's conscious of the time. Okay, so this creates ambiguity. How do you consider, or how do you determine what is Islamism from what is Islam? We understand that the term is used in the modern context to talk about a movement that is politically driven, uses faith, uses religion, and it uses a set of behaviors. But we don't understand what those set of behaviors are, because those set of behaviors share an affinity with the religion of Islam. And the religion of Islam talks about prayer, it talks about fasting, it talks about pilgrimage, it talks about social religious responsibility. And when we look at what Islamist movements are purported to use, well, they use prayer, they use fasting, they use pilgrimage, they use social religious responsibility. So how do you determine what is Islamism from what is mainstream Islam? Conceptually, you can do it, because on paper you're not actually doing any, you're not delivering any results, you're providing information. But when you try to apply that principle, you try to apply that definition in real time in the context, in the operational field, as many practitioners in the front line need to do. For argument's sake, those who have a statutory responsibility, those who work for the councils, those who work in a higher education, those who work for the security services, who champion prevent, those folks who deliver this or need to deliver upon this agenda, how do they differentiate it? And how do they draw a line of distinction between legitimate faith practice and between something that, or somebody that wants to potentially overthrow the government? That's a difficult question. So whilst you're deliberating that, let me ask you again. Let me ask you that question again, folks. What's the difference? What is the difference? And if you're thinking, oh, I don't know what the difference is, and if you're thinking that there's an ambiguity there, you'd be absolutely right. And that ambiguity leads to some of these kind of things. The depiction of Muslims as these crazy nuts. That, potentially everybody is a militant terrorist, bomber, or suicide bomber. In fact, some of you may remember an article that was published by a tabloid newspaper several years ago that said 1 in 5 Muslims support jihad. And there was, I think, a program run by one of the main networks on telly, the Jihadi next door. So that's the kind of consequence that arrives from this sort of ambiguity, the inability to differentiate what is legitimate faith practice from what is a criminal act, and who the legitimate community is from who the illegitimate community is. And that leads to this kind of narrative, the inability to differentiate, the suspect community potential, and the labeling of the entire religion as something that is potentially problematic and Islamist by nature. And it legitimizes it. In public discourse, it legitimizes it. In the mainstream media, it legitimizes it. And it cements that ambiguity even further, to the point where we have folks like Donald Trump saying that Islam hates us. If Islam hates us, then, why is there peace around the world to the extent that 1.8 billion Muslims aren't trying to overthrow nation states and governments all around the world? So is it a problem with Islam, or is it a problem with Islamism? But the distinction is ambiguous, which leads to those kind of statements. You've got Boris Johnson's statement, the Prime Minister, two of the arguably the most influential offices and most powerful offices in the world. One talking about Islam, the entire religion, hating the world or hating the United States, and the other who considers it acceptable to refer to Muslim women as bank robbers and letterboxes, legitimizing that kind of sentiment against Muslims and Islam. And you've got Sayyid Awasi that talks about, how endemic these sentiments are within government, from the bottom all the way to the very top. So these are the consequences of ambiguity and not being able to define terms, and using terms that have an historical genealogy rooted in colonial empire, and not being able to define the differentiation between mainstream normative Islam and the militant proposition of Islam, or the Islamist proposition of Islam, rather conflating one with the other. And when you look at that ambiguity and you measure that against what the National Counter Terrorism Strategy is, you have the imperative of act now and act early. Well, how will communities act now and act early if there isn't trust and confidence within the service or within the authority that delivers that agenda? If there's ambiguity based on identity, and Maranchi's work is fantastic if you want to look at identity, social constructivist identity, and also I've done some research on this around how theological identities intertwine into the broader reality and experience within Muslim communities referred to as the Ummah. If the conception or perception is there that the agenda has been conceived to challenge Islam in and of itself, and there is perhaps a small degree of resonance of truth within that because of the inability to distinguish the militant proposition of faith against the legitimate proposition of faith, or Islamism against Islam. Yet your success in challenging Islamism in the community is rooted within the government strategy against, with communities against terrorism, meaning that you need the communities to report it, you need them to act now, you need them to act early, you need them to see it, say, report it, sort it, as the kind of counter-terrorism promotional campaign was. And you need people to be your eyes and ears in the community to report these things. How will that ever happen if the trust and confidence is absent from the conversation? So communities don't trust you enough to pick up the phone to make that referral, or to send an email to make that referral, because the perception is that this isn't an agenda to deal with terrorism. This is an agenda to challenge Islam. And these are some of the criticisms that Prevent has faced in its historical genealogy. And even though there's a great amount of effort to try and turn that ship around, distance itself from that image and from the brand of toxicity that it's been attributed to, the mentality is still there. In the Muslim consciousness is still there. And if you look at Project Champion, in Birmingham West Midlands Police, and the memory of that is still very live. If you look at the referral rates to Prevent it, certainly within the early days of referral, those kind of sentiments are still live within the Muslim consciousness, and they're woven in to the Muslim identity. And part of that has been a product of ambiguity around the use of the term. Yeah, and there's been challenge not only by Muslim actors in community, but also by Muslim actors in the service. So folks who work for counterterrorism policing have argued, well, we find this term problematic because we feel as though it depicts our religion as something that is belligerent and inherently violent. And in fact, some folks have actually said that I feel as though every time the term is mentioned, I need to actively distance myself from it because that's not me and that doesn't define me. And incidentally, these are individuals who are security cleared, who work in counterterrorism, and these are folks who actually challenge Islamism in all its forms and all its facets, and seek to root it out. Yet they themselves feel as though they're being marginalised by the use of this term. And the National Association of Muslim Police is doing some work on this at this moment in time, which is running live. And there's a survey in circulation, or shortly will be in circulation. It was being put together at the time that this recording was done. And perhaps by the time that you watch this recording, that survey will be complete. So there's various different actors within the social space, within the community space, within the internal space that are challenging the use of the term. And in fact, the book that is the book that is sorry, let me try and figure this out. I'm a tech issue. But the book that was referred to by Martin Blanchard talks about the issues with it, as does Martin Kramer and as does Mehdi Muzaffari. They talk about the issues with the term Islamism, and these have been going around since 2007, 2008, 2009. Yet in 2020 we're still finding the same discussions taking place, and that has an impact. It has an impact and it has a resonance with communities that you need to develop support and relationships with. So the question that we often get asked, or the question that is often asked, is that, well, Islamism is embedded in the public consciousness. It's embedded in policy circles. It's embedded in academic circles. If we're not going to use Islamism, then what are we going to use? And that's a good question, because you need to have a label for it. Whatever it is, you need to describe it. So the proposition that I'm championing is FATE. And FATE is an acronym which stands for Faith, Alleged Terrorism and Extremism. And again, if you read the works of Bruce Hoffman and the works of folks like Martha Crenshaw, they detail the history of what we understand as contemporary terrorism. Certainly Hoffman does all the way back to the very beginning of human civilization in many respects, dating back to the Zealot Sakari in the 1st century. He talks about Hoffman talks about the Hindu thugs in the 12th and 13th century. He talks about the Muslim assassins, in the 17th, I think, century, all the way through to contemporary movements. And there's also other folks that talk about the actual nation state being a terrorist actor as well, because modernity or secularism has taken the place of religion. The state has become the sacred, but that's a whole separate conversation. That's worth having at a separate time. But for the purposes of an alternative, when we look at FATE, we look at faith, alleged terrorism and extremism. Any organization that has used faith as a vehicle for violence has alleged at some point within that history or within that genealogy that this is legitimate. This is a movement rooted in religion. You had the Zealot Sakari, as mentioned, talk about it. You had Urban II at the Council of Clermont when he galvanized the Christian Crusaders under the cross to go and exterminate the vile race, referring to the Saracen Muslims who had occupied Palestine, as a legitimate faith-led movement. Faith alleged just war theory from all that kind of all that era where it was developed and applied was rooted in the understanding that these are legitimate faith practices, and that's how they were pushed. And even in the contemporary period, when you look at operators who use religion as a vehicle, veneer, or a medium for the purposes of what is considered to be political intent, then that is entirely a fate phenomenon. It's faith, alleged terrorism and extremism, because I think it's wholly problematic to argue the proposition that faith is in and of itself inherently violent. And there are actors that do that. There are academics who have written on that. If you look at some of the works of Richard Rubinstein around the development of jihad, you look at Batier's work, who talks about how jihad spread, and it was an Arab imperialist kind of violent movement that was legitimized by Islam through the medium of religion to continue the Arab expansion, arguing that it's inherently violent and rooted within religion. And there's others. Cook, I think, also argues from a similar position as well. Now that's fine, but then you need to kind of counterbalance that against those folks who say, well, actually, that isn't never been the case. There was an incredible amount of restraint shown in the formative period, focusing specifically on Islam. In the formative period of Islam, John Esposito talks about this, Richard Bonney talks about this, some great works to have a look at if you're interested in this area of research. But the point is that all of this comes back to, well, if you're going to attribute it a label, then what are we going to call it? And my proposition is that we call it fate, because any actor who has utilized faith and religion as a vehicle for violence has alleged it to be legitimate. So it's nothing more than faith alleged terrorism and extremism. Now, conscious of the time, based upon all of this, understanding the genealogy of the term, understanding where it's come from, understanding the ambiguity around it, understanding the need to have the trust and confidence within the Muslim community to counter terrorism at a grassroots level, to counter Islamism at a grassroots level, and how arguably that term, through its ambiguity, has fed into eroding that trust and confidence. Let me ask you a question. To what extent does the use of language in counter-terrorism arenas frame Muslim communities as suspect? And I'll leave that with you to ponder over. Folks, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm just within time. I could talk about this all day, but very, very briefly, some references in research. Gabriel Moranchi, Jihad Beyond Islam. Martin Kramer, Coming to Terms with Fundamentalism. Mehdi Muzaffari also talks about the same thing. And the National Association of Muslim Police will have a website, and they'll be looking at their research, the survey around the use of language and all of that stuff that we mentioned in the presentation on their website. So it should be uploaded fairly soon. That's it from me, folks. It's been a privilege. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.